Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tracy Glab, Executive Director of the Flint Institute of Arts Museum and Art School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture. Today, we have Dr. Marcus Cruz presenting Marco Polo's America, the Medieval Influence on Early Modern Maps of the New World. The Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture was established in 2012 by Dr. Alan Klein to address the topics of art, religion, and history. Thank you, Dr. Klein, for continuing to bring these wonderful lectures to the FIA. And the next Sheppy Dog Fund lecture will actually be in around 4 hours, with Dr. Cruz portraying the fantastic Gothic architecture and contemporary cinema. So that will be quite interesting as well. And then the very next Sheppy Dog Fund lecture will be in about a month on Wednesday, May 28th, with Dr. Robert D. Caroli presenting Gods, Ghosts, and Spirits in Buddhist Art and Tradition. Before I introduce our guest, I would like to thank the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for their continued support, which is so deeply appreciated and vital to the FIA. I would like to thank the citizens of Genesee County for demonstrating their support of the FIA by means of the Genesee County Arts Education and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which provides free entry to the FIA for Genesee County residents 7 days a week. And a big thank you to Huntington Bank for sponsoring Huntington Free Saturdays, which allows everyone outside of our county to have free entry on Saturdays. Thank you, Huntington. We also like to note that for about a month now, we have a new feature. It is called Assisted Listening Devices. Are now available at the FIA, in the theater, Isabel Hall, and in the Hot Shop. You can request one of these devices from the front desk to check out, or you can use your own Bluetooth device by scanning the QR code, which is available right when you walk into the theater on that sign on the left there. And the only trick to it is you have to make sure you're connected to the Listen Wi-Fi on our free Wi-Fi, because that will be what connects you to the assisted listening. And then the app also has more information in the middle there. So please take a moment to silence your electronic devices. Make sure mine is, which pocket is it? There we go. There we go. Dr. Marcus Cruz is Associate Professor of French at Arizona State University. As a medievalist, he has published on a wide range of topics, including medieval theater, heraldry, writing tablets, the Louvre, Marco Polo, and global trade. Forthcoming in 2025 are 2 books about the Mongol archive in late medieval France, and the writer Christine de Besson. He's a member of the Institute for Advanced Study and has twice been a fellow at the National Humanities Center. Please, everyone, join me in a warm Flint welcome for Dr. Marcus Cruz.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Great. So I would first like to express my sincerest thanks to the FIA for the invitation to come back. This is my 3rd time presenting for the Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture, and it's always a joy to be back with you. I especially want to thank Becky Schanzer and Catherine Schaubar for arranging the logistics of my visit, and of course, as Tracy just said, Dr. Alan Klein, who is a wonderful guy and a very lucky guy who's retired and gets to travel around the world and still manages to support us here at Flint. I think that's a wonderful thing. So deepest thanks to Dr. Klein. The FIA is very lucky to have such a committed patron. So I'm going to talk to you today about Marco Polo's America and the medieval influence on early modern maps of the New World. And I want to begin by explaining how it is that, as you just heard, a professor of French and a medievalist is going to talk to you about Marco Polo and early modern maps. In fact, the answer is very straightforward. So Tracy just mentioned this book. It is now out. It came out in February. And this book is a study of contact between France and the Mongols in the late Middle Ages. This is now one of my main areas of study. Now, the reason that this intersects with today's topic is that Marco Polo wrote his book titled The Description of the World in a dialect of French. He wrote it for an international audience. So as I was writing this book, I was living in Polo world. And Polo world takes you in very many interesting directions, because once you start to think about the reception of Marco Polo, who's reading him? How long are they interested in him? What you learn is that he's interesting to people for a very long time, arguably, of course, down to the present. But people are reading Polo and making maps using Polo's text well into the 17th century in Europe. And so at the end of this book, which as you see focuses on the period 1221 to 1422, I very briefly, in the conclusion, gesture to this later reception of Marco Polo. But the problem just kept turning around in my mind. I kept thinking, well, what exactly is the later reception of Marco Polo? How many maps are we talking, and where can we find all of this? And so this launched me on this project, on which I will be publishing an article in the next year or two. And another reason that I'm giving this talk is that I think that it's high time, and here's what I mean. When people think about the relationship between Marco Polo and early modern exploration and colonization, they usually focus on one person. Can you guess who that is? That's Columbus. That's exactly right. And the reason is fairly obvious. I'm showing you a picture of it right here. What I'm showing you is an opening from the early printed edition of Marco Polo that was in the possession of Christopher Columbus, which he read and which he annotated, at least in part. And this book still exists. It is still extant in the Columbus Library in Seville. So when people think about the relationship between Marco Polo and exploration and European colonization, this is usually Exhibit A, and then people will focus on Spain and Portugal in particular, and the ways that they are interested in Polo and influenced by Polo. And so as a French professor, one of my goals with the publication that I'm working on and with this talk is to restore France to this conversation and show you the ways in which this is a pan-European dialogue about how Marco Polo shaped early European perception of the Americas. And at the end of the talk today, you will see how we can take this right up to the present and into our own American experience. So, first we're going to talk about Polo's description of the world and its place in French culture. So what's important, as I noted, is that Polo writes his text in French, but what's more, the French royal family acquires a copy of Polo's book as of 1307, while Polo was still alive. He dies in 1324. It is the son of the King of France who sends an envoy named Thibaut of Sheppy to Venice, and that man, Thibaut, gets a copy of the description from Polo himself. By 1312, members of the French royal family are commissioning copies of Marco Polo's book. And the oldest extant copy of the book produced in France dates to 1335, so just shortly after Polo dies. And this book is in the Royal Library in London, and it was made for the King of France, King Philip, who reigned from 1328 to 1350. In the 1370s, we have two inventories that tell us that at one point, 5 copies of the description were in the Royal French Library, and in that library as well was the Catalan Atlas, which survives to the present, and which is the oldest extant map that uses Marco Polo's toponyms, his place names, his geography. And as it happens, the last time I was here at the FIA 2 years ago, that was what I talked about. the Catalan Atlas. And so if you're interested in knowing more about what I refer to as the most interesting map in the world, and I stand by that 2 years on, you can go on YouTube and you can see that talk, which I gave here 2 years ago. From the late 1300s to the 1530s, several copies of the description are produced in France for members of the royal family and their entourages. So again, we are talking about very elite readership. In 1532, the Novus Orbis is published, printed in Basel and Paris, a collection of 17 travel texts, one of which is Marco Polo's description of the world. And then in 1556, we have the only 16th century edition of the description in French that is printed in Paris. Now, this list is without going into greater detail concerning the many texts that either cite or paraphrase the description or that the description influences. So, why is all of this important? Why should we care about the reception of Marco Polo's text? Well, the answer is this, folks. For several generations, multiple centuries, Marco Polo's text was the only major and rational European source on the Far East. A number of years ago, I wrote an article about toponyms, place names, in Marco Polo's book, in which I argued that Marco Polo contributed at least 100 new place names to European knowledge. All of these were in the Far East. That is to say that Marco Polo greatly expanded the European understanding of the size of Asia, by which I mean its actual spatial dimensions, but also of its great urbanized cultures, the variety of cities and peoples and industries and resources that were to be found in the Far East. And so for centuries, Polo will be the one place that cartographers or cosmographers, people who write about the world, are going to go when they want to write about the Far East. And I can prove it with one great example. In 1492, Martin Behaim, a very prominent geographer and map maker and maker of globes, produces a globe that still exists to the present. And on that globe, he inscribes a legend off the east coast of India. And that legend reads, Ptolemy had not described the world any farther, that's to say, beyond the east coast of India. But Marco Polo and Mandeville wrote of the rest. So what is the Far East? To the late medieval and early modern mind, for a very long time, it is the Far East of Marco Polo. The reference to Mandeville here is also interesting, but we don't have time to go into it. Mandeville was a fictional travelogue written in the 1350s as a kind of response to or updating of Marco Polo, but it adds nothing new. Polo is the essential, important reference for thinking about the Far East in medieval Europe and early modern Europe. What is this Far East that Polo describes? Why does it seize the imagination so? Not only does it provide the names of toponyms and information about a new world, essentially, but it also says that this new world is infinitely rich. It has abundant wealth. And so with this slide and the next, I've just pulled out a few among the many textual passages that I could have used to show you how Polo does this. So let's just look at this very quickly together. We have references to gold, animals, musk, good fish, pearls, gold dust, clove, ginger, cinnamon, other spices, cowrie shells, more fish, more gold, even more gold, gold for silver, great profit and gain. A very interesting point. He says of some peoples that they live in faraway places or nobody ever sees them. No one knows where they live. Now, this is important because as explorers go out into the world, as they try to make their observations and experiences correspond to what they read about in Marco Polo, they always hear stories about how there are peoples or kingdoms just over the horizon or just over the next set of hills or just over the next river or lake. And so this motif of the inaccessible but almost touchable riches or peoples, which is established in Marco Polo, continues for several centuries in the writings and the experiences of European travelers. Again, we have a good deal of gold, we have spices, and we have another important reference here. Polo talks of people who are, let's go back up. People talks of people who are painted all over their body. Sound familiar? When the explorers go to the Americas, what are they going to discover? When they go around Africa, what are they going to discover? People painted all over their bodies. And so you can start to see how Polo establishes a whole vocabulary, a whole conceptual framework for thinking about new places that people are going to discover, Europeans are going to discover. Let's keep going. Just a few more examples. Jewelry made of gold and silver. More gold, more cowrie shells. The city of Kinsai, which is the modern Hangzhou, a port in China, where Polo spent quite a bit of time as far as we can tell, which Polo describes as the best and noblest city in the world. It's on the water and surrounded by water. It has great treasure, and the great Khan derives great income from it. Keep that name, Kinsai Hangzhou, in mind. It's going to come back in later exploration and cartography texts. And finally, Polo writes of Japan that it is abounding in gold, but the thing about Japan, according to Polo, is that it's very far out into the ocean, it's very hard to get to, and in any event, they don't trade with anybody. So don't bother. I hear that it's very wealthy, Polo says, but I didn't go there myself. But this also plants a seed. So what the Polo text does is plant all of these seeds about this endlessly wealthy Asia, and that is going to have a profoundly important effect on later cartography, exploration, and colonization by Europeans in the 15th and 16th centuries. So, since I'm a French professor, I'm going again to focus on the French experience, but I'm going to draw on other examples to contextualize the French experience. Now, the first thing to keep in mind is that although we don't think of the French as great explorers in the 16th century, they were trying to keep themselves in the game, in competition with Spain and Portugal and England. And so let's just look very briefly at two chronologies. The first is a chronology of French exploratory campaigns in the Americas, which, as you see, begin very early with the campaigns of Thomas Aubert. And then we have, very famously, the royally commissioned expedition of Giovanni da Verrazzano, who will sail from North Carolina to Newfoundland in 1524 and return and write a wonderful account of his travels. We have the three major expeditions of Jacques Cartier, of course. We have another expedition which Cartier will abandon, led by Jean Alphonse, a name that will return, and Roberval. In the 1550s, we have Guillaume le Testu, another name that will return this afternoon, who goes to map the coast of Brazil. In the 1580s, we have Canada and Bélanger, and in the 1580s, again, we have South America, led by Jacques Deveau and Guillaume le Hérissi. So the French are actively exploring throughout the Americas in this period. And what's more, they are also actively trying to colonize. The first major attempt in Canada is made in the 1540s. This is the campaign that Jacques Cartier will abandon. He decides that Roberval is not serious, and he doesn't want to risk himself and his men. In the 1550s, we have an attempt to establish a French colony in Brazil, in the 60s in South Carolina, and then in Florida, and then at the very end of the century in Canada again. Now, one thing I want you to notice about this chronology is that none of these colonies last for very long. Do you all notice that? Now, one of the reasons for that is simply logistical. The French have to go great distances, and they have to supply these people, and they have to keep supplying new people to these colonies as well. But the Spanish and the Portuguese and ultimately the English become very good at this. So why did the French fail in the 16th century? Well, another answer has to do with competition with Spain and Portugal. At least two of these attempts, that in Brazil and that in Florida, fell flat because, frankly, the French colonists were massacred by the Spanish and the Portuguese. Other attempts that the French made, which I don't include here, were stymied because the Spanish and the Portuguese would simply abduct their crews, take their ships. So the French were always behind in the great global game of exploration and colonization, and they're aware of this. But there are many internal reasons why this is so that we can perhaps get into in the Q&A. Nonetheless, even though the French are not having a great time of it, they keep trying. And one of the main reasons that they keep trying, I can explain with two maps. So the first map is this very famous map by Matthias Ringmann and Martin Waldseemüller from 1507. And what I want you to focus on are the Americas. Do you see them? Over here. Got it? There they are. There's North America, there's South America. And what's important about this map is that it is going on the theory that the Americas are isolated landmasses. You can very clearly see the western coasts, and then you can see that there is an ocean to the west. Therefore, the Americas are separate from Asia. Okay? That's all very clear. And it seems very rational to us because, of course, as we know, that is indeed the way things work. But they didn't know that. And 9 years later, when Waldseemüller produces his most famous map, his Carta Marina, which is a wall-sized map, now he's not so sure because he's getting other reports about the Americas. And what does he decide? Well, first I want you to look over here. That legend right there reads, Terra de Cuba Asiae Partis. What does that mean? The land of Cuba, which is part of Asia. And you will notice that whereas the same map maker 9 years earlier had depicted the Americas with clearly defined western coasts, now do you see any west coasts? No, you do not. What you see is that this land abuts with the border, as does this. There is no western coast now. And look even more carefully at the top right of this map, you will see that up here, Asia as well extends over to the border and abuts the border. There is no ocean that separates this land from this land. And in fact, the legend tells us why. Because in this map, what Waldseemüller is showing is that the Americas are an extension of Asia. So, what we are dealing with here is what we call speculative cartography. And it's important to keep this in mind. Because in fact, when did they actually finally figure out the relationship of the Americas to Asia? When did they finally explore the Bering Strait? And the answer is in the 1700s. And when did they actually sail across the Northwest Passage up there in the northern waters? Not until the early 1900s. So of course they don't know exactly what the configuration of this land is. But there are two going hypotheses, and it's really the only options that they have. Either the Americas are isolated landmasses, or we are talking about Amerasia. That's what it's called. There's a great book that came out about 3 years ago on this, by the way. But it gives short shrift to the French, which is another reason I felt I had to give this talk and write this article. It really focuses on Spain and Portugal, and there's a lot to say about the French in this. But Amerasia is this idea that is very current in many circles among the exploratory and political and cartographic elite in Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. This idea that, well, the Americas are probably an extension of Asia. And we see the influence of this idea in France very particularly. And it begins with this map, really. This is the map of Franciscus Monachus, that's to say Francis the monk. And Francis the monk publishes a treatise, which is a description of the world, in 1524. And the very opening of this, the first page, has this map, which is a fairly schematic map. But I want to see if you can make out what it is that you are looking at. And from this angle, it's kind of tricky, so I'm going to walk over this way. And it'll be easier for me. Can you read that? Indeed. And what is this? South America. Excellent. Now, can you see how to the northwest there is an extension, and then there's a narrow strait here. And then what is this up here? This is Asia. That is exactly right. This is Asia. Now get ready. I want you to put on your 16th century thinking caps, okay? Think like a 16th century cartographer. What's this? That's exactly right. This is Florida. What's that? Cuba, A+. What's this? Hispaniola, Haiti, Dominican Republic. So what is this? The Caribbean. That is exactly right. So this is how they picture, how they imagine what Amerasia looks like. At least this is one particular possibility. Now, another reason that this map is so important is because it is accompanied by a number of texts. As I said, it is the opening to this treatise. So here we have Francis the monk helping people to understand the map that he starts his treatise out with. He says, in the first place, you should note the different and often contradictory names for the same places, lest you be confused by them. According to Hernando Cortés, right, so the great conquistador, Culua, or the province of Culhuacana, which is to say Mexico, which in other travel narratives is called Cataya or Cathay, is where the realm of the emperor of the east lies. Now, I already hear some chuckles. Does anybody know what Cathay is? Cathay is northern China. It is the term that is used in medieval Europe for northern China. And the emperor of the east is, of course, the Great Khan, the Mongol lord of China. So what is Francis the monk saying? He is saying that the Americas and the Asia of Marco Polo are one and the same. Further, he says, the modern Tenochtitlan or Tenochtitlán, which is to say Tenochtitlan, so Mexico City, was formerly, there it is, Kinsai. There's our Chinese port again, where Marco Polo spent a fair amount of his time, Hangzhou. It was called Timisan by Odoric of Pordenone, who was closer to the truth. Odoric of Pordenone was an Italian Franciscan who goes to Asia in the 1320s and 30s and writes another treatise, but he's post-Polo. So Polo, again, is the essential reference here. Francis the monk goes on to say, in former times, Tevis was also known as Tibet or Sibet, that is to say, Tibet. The province of Mexico, in the time of our fathers, was known by the name Mansi, which was Manzi in the Middle Ages, and Manzi is the name for southern China, used throughout the late Middle Ages in Europe. Those places and regions which Marco the Venetian, Mandeville, and Odoric examined and described have now been discovered in the west by the Spanish and, led by Hernando Cortés, overcome by arms and found to extend as far as our borders in the east. In other words, what is Francis the monk saying? Who discovered America? Marco Polo. And now the lands that Polo described and discovered first and wrote about have been conquered by Cortés and the Spanish. Now this idea seizes the imaginations of many important people across Europe, and particularly in France. And so in 1531, a man named Laurence Fine, who is the royal mathematician and cartographer appointed by King Francis I, who reigned from 1515 to 1547, Laurence Fine produces this map, which is based on the lost map of Francis the monk. And this map is then published in the Novus Orbis, which is the compilation of travel texts that I mentioned earlier, which includes Marco Polo. And what we're looking at here is a double projection. On the left, we have the northern hemisphere with the North Pole in the center. And on the right, we have the southern hemisphere with the South Pole in the center. We're going to focus on the northern hemisphere. What I've done here is I have underlined in red some very important toponyms that come from Marco Polo and a couple that will surprise you. Let's start over here. We have Kinsai, there it is. There's our port, which Polo says is slightly inland and on a major river. Kashgar, the desert of Belor, the desert of Lup, Tongut. Oh, look over here. Cathay. There it is. Oh, and there's Mansi. So there's northern China and there's southern China because we're looking from the North Pole down. So as we go up, we're going south. But I want you to look between Mansi and Cathay. Can you read that? Temistetan. In other words, Tenochtitlan. Where are we? We're in Mexico, but we're also in Asia. But even better is this. What do we got right there? Mexico. There it is. So Laurence Fine, who, by the way, was a brilliant mathematician and an inventor of all kinds of navigational and scientific instruments, who people still study to this day. This man was no slouch, and he is working for the highest possible patron, the King of France. He has taken very seriously the Amerasian hypothesis. And what's more, as we wrap around to the left on this map, we come across this text here, which says Pucatans, which is a deformation of Yucatan. Down here we have Cuba. And down here, I think you can read that. The land of Florida, Terra de Florida, down there. So he has conflated American and Asian space just as Francis the Monk, just as Waldseemüller before that. So you're starting to see this trend. Now, another thing is, if we wrap around, if we come down to this portion of the map down here, look at what we find. The northeastern projection of Asia, as imagined by Laurence Fine, has this tongue that sticks out into the Atlantic, and it is called bacalar, and that is a deformation of the Spanish word bacalao, which means cod. And what this is, of course, is Newfoundland and Labrador. And now, as you start to contemplate this map and think about the king contemplating this map and think about the French elites, can you begin to understand why the French might be interested in exploring and colonizing Canada? What does that give you? Well, first of all, it's in the northern latitudes, away from Florida, away from South America, which are dominated by Spain and Portugal. So you avoid your enemies. And then the other thing is that from this spit of land here, you can navigate either overland or, if you can navigate it properly, through the Arctic zone, and you can reach this Asia, which again is the Asia of Marco Polo and infinite wealth. And so one of the main drivers, folks, of colonization and exploration in the Americas in this period is the Amerasian hypothesis and this understanding that if the European powers can get a toehold on the American coast, then they can start to work their way inland. And according to at least some cartographers and some explorers and some cosmographers, this land will lead you over to the Asia of infinite wealth of Marco Polo. We know that the King of France was taken by this idea because in his letter of commission for Jacques Cartier, after Cartier's first 2 expeditions, the king writes this, and among others, that's to say other explorers, we sent there, that is to say to Canada and the Americas, our dear and beloved Jacques Cartier, who discovered a large country in the lands of Canada and Hochelaga, that's to say the region around Montreal, which make up one end of Asia to the west, the which lands he found, as he reported to us, full of many good commodities, and the people there well endowed in body and well formed in mind and understanding. So what does access to Canada and settlement there promise? It promises access to Asia, to many good commodities. Cartier promises those just as Marco Polo had, and people. And it's very important that these people look like people, that they have good bodies and good minds, because with good minds they can be potentially converted and made subjects. And if they can't accept conversion, well, they have good bodies, they could be made slaves. So the people are another resource that the king is thinking about. So this is part 1, to establish the importance of the Amerasian hypothesis and Polo's influence on it in Europe and in France in particular. And this brings me to the second point. My second example is that of Jean Alphonse's Cosmographie, his cosmography of 1545. Jean Alphonse is a name that you've seen now a couple of times because he was a very prominent navigator and captain and explorer himself. He went all over the world in his career, and he was selected by the king to go on the royal expedition in the 1540s to try to settle Canada. That's the expedition that Cartier wanted nothing to do with eventually. He said this isn't going to work, and he went back home. So Alphonse, having returned from Canada a couple of years later, sits down to write a text that he hopes will be a resource for all of those French, either investors who want to invest in exploration and colonization attempts, or for the government, or for explorers themselves, or people who are interested in attempting these kinds of explorations. And what is very interesting to me, as a medievalist who works on Marco Polo and the Mongols, is that Jean Alphonse, as he is writing his text, is paying very close attention to Marco Polo. Now, he doesn't say that he draws on Marco Polo, but he says that he read authors of good authority. And he cites many, many passages from Marco Polo's book. So not only does he talk extensively about the Tartars, which is the medieval European name for the Mongols, but he also has several references to the Great Khan, and he uses Polo's toponymy, and he has several episodes from Polo's text, which I won't go into. But the important thing here is the number of citations from out of Marco Polo's book. So it's quite clear that he is very deeply influenced by Marco Polo. And here's what he writes about the Americas. He says, all these lands, that's to say the Americas, are called Cathay, northern China. China. And I think that they are the end of the Orient, so they're part of Asia. Yet I say that the land of New Spain and of Peru is attached to them. So even though it's further south, it is also part of this geographical complex. However, no one has sailed far enough to know if there is a sea between them or if they are joined to each other. And we just saw that with the map of Francis the Monk. He imagines a strait between South America and Asia, but it's a very narrow strait. And as for me, I say that the land of Canada is the end of Asia, and that there is no sea between them unless it be some small arm of the sea. And this, I think, is the best part of this, unless it be. So just like our cartographers, what's he doing? He's hedging. He's not sure, right? This is also speculative cartography. But he's pretty sure, given all the evidence that he has seen and heard, that Canada is indeed an extension of Asia. And then he gives us some really rich details. He says that no one knows about Peru, which he knows is in the south, because of mountains, snow, and storms, but he thinks it is attached to the land that is attached to Java. So he's pretty sure it's part of Asia. He says that the people of South America have Persian faces because he's seen them. So we have more of this conflation of Asian space and American space. He suspects that a bay that is the entry to Saguenay. Now, Saguenay is the name that Cartier and other French explorers heard from the natives in Canada relating to an inland kingdom that was very powerful and very wealthy, and it became one of the main goals of French exploration was to get to Saguenay. Well, Alphonse suspects that a bay that is the entry to Saguenay in inland Canada leads to the Pacific or to the Sea of Cathay, so what we would call the China Sea. He says that Hochelaga, the region near Montreal, the settlement, connects to Peru, which abounds with gold and silver. And then he goes on to say, and these lands, so North and South America, are attached to Tartary. Well, where is Tartary? It's the land of the Mongols. It's in Asia. And I think that this is the end of Asia following the roundness of the world. And finally, my favorite passage in the whole text, the people of Florida are dressed in a Tartar manner. That's to say, they dress like Mongols. So you see that here we are in the 1540s. There's been a lot of exploration at this point. Magellan has circumnavigated, or his one ship circumnavigated the globe a generation before this, and yet there is still this debate, still this wondering about the true configuration and location of the Americas, and this layering of Asian space onto American. Now this brings me to my last example, which is that of Guillaume Le Testu, who also writes a text which he titles The Cosmography, the description of the world. But this book is of particular interest because of the extraordinary story of its author and because of the book's extraordinary content. So Le Testu, like Alphonse, was one of the most experienced navigators and captains in France in his day. He sailed a great deal, and you saw his name earlier because in the 1550s, he first sailed across the Atlantic to Brazil in order to map the coast of Brazil, and then a couple of years later, he was asked to bring provisions to the ultimately failed French colony in Brazil. Le Testu was convinced that France needed to step up its game, that the French were falling way behind the Spanish and the Portuguese and the English in the global race to colonize and acquire access to all of these riches and resources and peoples around the world. And so he wrote this cosmography and dedicated it to the Admiral of France, Gaspard de Coligny, knowing that the Admiral would then give it to the King. And so really what this book is a kind of ideological argument that is made through maps and texts for why the French themselves have the right and, in fact, the obligation to go out into the world and explore and colonize. And in order to make this argument, this is what Le Testu does. He writes a text in which, among many authorities, he cites repeatedly, either openly or implicitly, Marco Polo. So now we're in the 1550s, and we still see Polo coming back and influencing people's understandings of the relationship between Asia and the Americas and the importance of Asia. So he actually cites Polo in one passage. He says, "Near the Riffian Mountains are people with dogs' heads who bark instead of speak, as Marco the Venetian says." Now, this is not true, by the way. Polo does not say this. So, but Le Testu is really interesting for this reason. Like Jean Alphonse, these are not literary men. They're not sitting there in their studies reading books all the time. These are men of action who are moved to write these cosmographies. So sometimes they miscite. Sometimes they don't use their sources perfectly, but that's okay. What's interesting to us is that he's citing Marco Polo. Here's a whole list of places from Polo that he cites, and in particular, notice that he talks about Qinsai, and he talks about Manji, southern China, which we've already seen on French maps. Concerning Qinsai, he says, "It is judged to be the largest city in the world, having in the middle a lake around which there are 1,200 bridges." In fact, Polo says 12,000. It's another misquotation, but that's okay. He's trying to show that he knows his Polo. And then Le Testu is especially interesting and important because he portrays an America that is connected to Eurasia from both the east and the west. And so this is what the book looks like. And you can go online and you can find scans on the French website Gallica, Gallica, where they have scanned a lot of the treasures in the possession of the French National Archives and the French National Library. And you'll notice that this manuscript is actually not kept at the French National Library. It's kept in the military archive down to the present, because it was considered, and still is considered, a great state treasure from a maritime and military perspective. So on this folio, what you see is a map of the world. The world has been flattened out and cut into 4 petals to try to retain more or less accurate proportions and coordination. At the top, you see an escutcheon with the royal coat of arms of the French monarchy surmounted by a crown, so clearly a reference to the French monarchy. And then you see a crescent moon here along the bottom of this beautiful circle. And the crescent moon was the symbol, the emblem of King Henry II, who was king when this was made. And then down here, you see the arms of Gaspard de Coligny, who was the Admiral of France, and you can see that there is an anchor down here. So the Admiral of France is the person to whom this is all dedicated, and the way the book works is on one page, you'll have a map, and on the facing page, you'll have text explaining or describing what you're looking at. So let's look at this in more detail. Take some time to orient yourselves. Do you see what you're looking at? Can you read that right there? La Floride. Got it? There's Florida. What's that? Cuba. Exactly right. So this is the Caribbean. Exactly right. Gulf of Mexico. So here we have North America. And actually, once your mind locks into it, it's pretty recognizable, isn't it? You get it. But what does Le Testu imagine about North America? Well, notice that he has given us a beautiful rubric here. What's that say? Canada. That's exactly right. There's Canada. There is what the French are after, right there. And it connects to Asia. Do you all see that? There's an overland route. North America is still a projection of Asia, even in Le Testu's much later conception. And you will notice that we are indeed in the realm of Marco Polo because we have a reference to Tangut, which comes from Polo, to the desert of Balor, to Kamul, and to Cathay. There it is again. There's China. Okay? So Le Testu is still operating on the assumption that if the French are able to establish a colony in Canada, what will they have? They will have overland access to the riches, the infinite wealth of the Asia described by Marco Polo. And what's more, again, speculative cartography, he speculates, because he doesn't know for sure, but he hypothesizes that there is actually a river system. Now, do you see these lines here? Do you see why this is important? What would this allow for? Trade, the transmission of goods and people, along an inland water route that would be much favorable, much preferable to going over this route into the Arctic lands, which of course would be cold and desolate and difficult to cross. If you had a southern route, more southerly route, that was water that connected all the way across the continent, wouldn't that be wonderful? Well, indeed, Cartier and Alphonse, as we just saw, and others speculated that that did indeed exist. And actually, us being here in Michigan is very appropriate to this discussion, is it not? Because what was one of the things that spurred this speculation? It was the Great Lakes, the extent of which they didn't know about for quite a while, and certainly the French had not explored fully by 1556. So Le Testu goes on and produces many, many more maps in this book, one of which is a map of Asia, of the Far East. And here again, he is drawing on several sources, one of which is Marco Polo. Here you can read, and Oriental, Eastern India. I should point out that India was the term used in Europe for centuries for all of the East, not just what we think of as the subcontinent today. But India was a term that was applied generally to Asia, especially the east of Asia in this period. So down here we have the Great Khan. Over here we have the Khan again. He is hunting, and this particular scene illustrates an episode in Marco Polo. Polo says that when the Great Khan goes hunting, his hounds are cared for by two brothers. Well, there are the brothers, and this is a greyhound, which was one of the main hunting dogs used in medieval and early modern Europe, still used to this day. Now, if we look at a little more detail, we can appreciate more fully the influence of Marco Polo here. Because there is a rubric above the Great Khan, and it says, Le Grand Champ. That's French for the Great Khan. There he is, seated in front of his tents. as a nomad. And if we come over here, we can see that there is a legend that says, in this lake there are many gems, many precious stones. This also is a citation taken out of Marco Polo. And up at the top of the map, we have another legend, hard to make out, but I'll read it. It says, the great Khan, emperor and lord of India and Tartary. So again, showing the reader that he is familiar with the Asian geography of Marco Polo. And we have the great region of Cathay. And down here we have the province of Manji, so Manzi, southern China, qui est fort riche. Any French speakers here? Which is very rich. So he's emphasizing the wealth of the region. So he is reminding the Admiral of France and the King of France, as they are flipping through this series of maps and texts, that if we can establish a colony in Canada, we will have access to this and to the wealth, and the powerful people in this part of the world. When he gets to portraying Canada, Le Testu is equally interesting. Because, first of all, he makes it very clear, this is Le Canada, there it is. Here's Labrador up here. It's green, it has animals, it has settlements. But the most interesting detail is the banner right here. Can you all make this out? Do you see the crescent moons again? I just showed you these. These are the emblem of King Henry II of France. But look more carefully. Do you see a fleur-de-lis by any chance? Can you make it out? Just there. Underneath the banner, as it flaps in the wind, we can see that this is actually a banner that also bears the royal arms of France, thereby saying this land is, or it should be, in an ideal world it would be, under the dominion of the King of France. But the implicit ideological argument of this image becomes even more apparent if you look at another detail. Did you find it yet? What's this say down here? Coast of Florida. Can you all see that? Can you all see whose banner flies over Florida? The King of Spain. And so what Le Testu has actually done with this map is remind the Admiral and the King of France, the Spanish are already well established in this part of the Americas. If we want any hope of establishing a colony and a toehold in this part of the world, this is where we have to go, where we have already sent explorers, where we have already tried to colonize, where we have made contact with the natives, where we know about the landscape and the nature. That is our key into having access to that infinitely wealthy Asia, and who knows what other riches in the Americas themselves. So this brings me to the end of Polo's influence. How does this story actually end? Well, one way to end it is to focus on developments in the 16th century, and especially as they pertain to France, because that story is especially tragic as concerns the French. In 1572, our great promoter of French exploration and colonization, Le Testu, dies in Panama while undertaking a joint military operation with the English against the Spanish. As far as we know, that is when and where he dies. And that is especially interesting or evocative because within only a few weeks, there will occur in France one of the most significant moments in modern European history, known as the St. Bartholomew Days Massacre, which is when the tensions between Catholics and Protestants in France explode and lead France into a civil war that will last off and on for decades. Admiral Coligny, to whom Le Testu dedicates his cosmography, is killed in Paris during that massacre. And as a result of the death of Le Testu and Coligny, and as a result of France's descent into civil war, royal sponsorship of exploration effectively ends for decades and really only picks back up in the 1600s. So the French lose a great deal of ground to the English and the Spanish and the Portuguese. This is one thing that explains the configuration, the colonial configuration of the Americas, and why the French have such a hard time establishing a toehold. But in addition to France's internal problems, there is also the issue of what happens on a global scale to Marco Polo's status. What I mean by that is that in 1584, Abraham Ortelius prints a map of China that is the first one drawn from post-Polo sources. Now notice the date. What makes this possible? Why is there suddenly this turning away from Polo? And the answer, of course, is that there are Jesuit and other missionaries who at this point are establishing themselves in China, and they are acquiring not only their own eyewitness knowledge of the geography and the topography, but they are also acquiring local Asian maps and gaining knowledge from local informants. And so Ortelius decides that Polo is outdated, he's archaic, and at this point, Polo moves from being a contemporary resource for cartography to being a valued antiquarian source. Now, Polo will still be used by mapmakers into the 1600s. It doesn't just end like that. It's not like turning off the tap. But Polo's reputation as a source for cartography is greatly diminished in this period. Even more so because in 1588, we have the publication of this map, perhaps by the Italian Jesuit Michele Ruggeri, but in any event, this map is considered the first fully missionary map, a map made by missionary sources. And it is another map of China that shows very clearly the Chinese coast. And at this point, then, Polo is thoroughly discarded and marginalized. Now, I could end with that, and that would be perfectly appropriate. But I have a little postscript for you. Because a few weeks ago, I was in Virginia, and I went to Monticello, where they have a lovely museum. And as I was walking through the museum, I was struck by how it echoed with this map by Le Testu. Remember what I said about Le Testu? What does he imagine on this map? He's speculating. But he speculates that there might be a way to go from the St. Lawrence and follow some internal river system that will take you all the way across North America, and that river will open up in the Pacific right across from Japan. That says Zipangre, Japan. And Japan will be a way station, a stepping stone on the way to Marco Polo's Asia. Do you see how that works? There's this perfect alignment that he imagines here to spur the Admiral of France and the King of France to want to explore. Does this echo anything in our experience? A+. That's exactly right. Recall that in 1803, Jefferson writes his instructions to Meriwether Lewis, and this is what he says: "The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal stream of it as by its course and communication with the waters of the Pacific Ocean may offer the most direct and practicable water communication across this continent for the purposes of commerce." And so what strikes me about that is that the dream of contact between Asia and America that was begun with Christopher Columbus, that continued throughout almost the entirety of the 16th century, in many ways never died. And this idea that there must be some way for America to connect with the infinite wealth of Asia lived on and indeed inspired Jefferson himself and the Lewis and Clark expedition. So, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and questions.